The dead bodies that were scattered in Bucha in Ukraine are a sight of great concern and sadness. Russia says the images are staged, but Ukraine and its Western allies accuse Russia of being behind such atrocities in Ukraine, with the U.S. president once again calling the Russian president a war criminal that should be tried. But what about U.S. and its allies' atrocities committed in other parts of the world like Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, or Iraq? Can those be dismissed just as collateral damage? Well, in this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at the double standards there and ulterior motives that the U.S. may have when it comes to the Ukrainian conflict. Let me first introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. We have Ian Williams, international affairs analyst, who joins us from New York. Also joining us, Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, who joins us from Bristol. Welcome to you both. Let me first start with you, Ian Williams, and ask you about what we have seen on Bucha and the way that it's been covered and what has occurred there. Ukraine accuses the Russian military of massacring hundreds of civilians there. Russia denies the killing of civilians and argues that the images of dead bodies have been staged. What do you think?
Yes, the Russian military almost certainly massacred hundreds of civilians there. It's their calling card. We have satellite imagery showing the bodies in the street. We have eyewitnesses seeing the bodies. We have the bodies themselves with bullets in them. We have them in the side of Russian bases. So this is a slam dunk, and no amount of protestation from Sergei Lavrov, who I knew at the United Nations and used to have more credibility than this, because he used to confess to disquiet at what the Serbs were doing, but then stood up and defended them. And now, yes, there are double standards. Yes, when Joe Biden calls for international war crimes trials of Putin and the Russians, he is quite right, as long as he says this applies to others as well, as long as it applies to the Israelis over what they did in Gaza and Lebanon. But he protects them all of the time. And this is where the United States has consistently disarmed itself and also disarmed the United Nations human rights mechanisms. Because by showing it was willing to use its veto on behalf of a proxy state, Israel, it's giving sort of carte blanche or carte blanche to the Russians to do the same. It's very difficult to put your hand on your heart and say they must be prosecuted, it's a war crime. But those aren't war crimes because they're our allies doing it, and we've been covering for them all along. And this is the fundamental hypocrisy of the situation at the moment. It's interesting watching, what we see here is very much like what we saw in Grozny. Look at those pictures of Grozny, where the Russians went to liberate the Chechens again. And now those liberated Chechens are coming and visiting the same damage on the people around Kiev and in Ukraine. There's atrocity after atrocity. And
right.
Trying to pretend that our side's atrocities don't matter, but theirs do, is really... It's as bad as, it's worse than a crime. It's stupid, because it means you're laying yourself open, which is what Biden's doing.
Let's break this open a little bit more. Obviously, first we need to get an idea of both sides. Tony Gosling, the Russian president, had just came out a few hours back accusing Ukrainian authorities of actually being behind this, what he has called crude and cynical provocations. If you can describe what he may mean by that. And he said this was an assessment as it was described, again, of Kiev regime's crude and cynical provocation in the city of Bucha. What does he mean by that?
Well, your viewers are very privileged, because here in the West we are not getting any balanced coverage. It's great to have someone to discuss and debate this with, putting both sides, as should have been being put on Monday at the UN Security Council, except the British chair of the Security Council stopped that discussion even happening. So that, of course, is what the Western media need for a propaganda blitz on one side. I think, very few of us were actually in these places at the time. And only those who were and who have access to the evidence can really make a decision and a judgment one way or the other. But I think the likelihood is, considering we had a 2-day gap between when the Russians pulled out of Bucha and when these allegations were made, including with the mayor actually making no mention of this as well in the interim, so that apparently this hadn't happened in the meantime. These are bits of evidence which all need to be put together if there is to be any kind of but I would suggest what's going on here is yet another Western provocation and accusations being thrown, which at the moment it doesn't seem to me as if there is really strong evidence one side or the other committed. We know that we have Azov battalion Nazis roaming around on the Ukrainian side, and it is absolutely possible that they are using things like sabotage, false flag, manipulation to manipulate the Western press in the propaganda war, because although the Russians seem as if they're much stronger on the ground, in the information war, I'm afraid the Russians, as Sergei Lavrov himself admitted, are really small players, and they're very, very much behind the curve. And so the NATO countries, the Western press, think that they can win through propaganda. And of course, the problem with that is if you don't get these sorts of events, the so-called Russian atrocities, which may be Ukrainian atrocities, if you don't get the Western press interrogating these, what then happens is you can create the situation where NATO, who I believe are very much involved in Ukraine, although they like to hold their hands up and say, no, nothing to do with us. And I've got a lot of evidence for NATO carrying out atrocities through Gladio, basically picking up from the Nazi werewolves in World War II. That they may well be involved. The problem is, if this is allowed to not be interrogated in the Western press, the way it's been, this kind of what you might call propaganda blitz, blaming the Russians when we don't really know, there's been no proper investigation yet, right. These headlines will stick in people's minds. And the thing is that these kinds of things may be used in the future to give through the media, the West's NATO countries an excuse to get involved, say, well, look at this atrocity, now it's time, we must act, we must actually send NATO troops in. And of course we all know where that could lead. Exactly.
Well, let's talk about what you mentioned there, what Tony Gosling mentioned there, Ian Williams, about the UK. We're looking at how there should be an investigation that Russia has called for a UN Security Council meeting on this, but the UK blocked it. Why do you think the UK did that?
I think the UK blocked it in disgust, absolute disgust. And for once, I agreed with this British government at the bravado and the chutzpah of the Russians committing a massacre and then saying, oh, look what they made me do. Let's get it straight. There was one day between the Russians leaving, fleeing, by the way, because they were defeated by the locals who hate them. They fled. Then reporters came in. I know some of those reporters personally. They would not lie. What did they see? They saw bodies that had visibly been lying there for days. Their fingers are black and rotten. They are buried in the earth. There's satellite pictures showing those bodies for 3 weeks before, during the Russian occupation. Independent private satellites were taking pictures. The Americans could probably provide better ones because they have better definition, but it was a private company. Other reporters came in and saw it. They went round them. Locals went in. We have eyewitness testimony from locals saying the Russians came and shot my wife, my husband, shot my children, or were doing this, that, and the other. You've got the actual Russian bases with the Russian MREs scattered around, and the vodka bottles, lots of vodka bottles, which they looted from the houses, and the corpses next to them, buried in their bases. I mean, this is so slam dunk. I'm very glad that Tony Gosling has at last had the temerity to admit there's a possibility that the Russians might have done it. This is a slam dunk, and it is a war crime. And yes, there are other war crimes. No amount of whataboutery about the sins, Sabra and Shatila, what's happening in Yemen. I agree with all of those. But I have been party at the United Nations for almost 20 years at the attempt to operationalize the International Criminal Court of Justice. I supported it against Milosevic. I supported it against the Sudanese in Darfur, and I support it now against the Russians. I would also support it against the Americans if they did My Lai. It was a friend of mine who broke the story of My Lai, the American atrocity. But none of us ever said, what about? What about? And that is really the big cry that the Russians keep producing. They did this in Grozny before. They have committed unspeakable atrocities against their own people in the Civil War.
Okay.
And well, this is their calling card. Look at the pictures of Grozny, look at the pictures of Kiev, and you see. It almost says, thank you, Moscow, on the bottom of that postcard.
Well, we need to talk about the past here. Tony Gosling, you can take your pick here. I have some that I noted here. Haiti, where there were indiscriminate killings of Haitians under direct command of a U.S. officer going back decades ago. Obviously, we're looking at what happened after World War II, and the Pacific War, as it was called. And it was quite interesting, some of the stuff that came out of this. The Korean War, the No-Gun Rye Massacre, all of these involve U.S., and all of these involved what many say are war crimes, with hundreds and hundreds were killed. Of course, the more recent ones, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. Which ones would you like to put into perspective for us?
Well, I'd like to look much more closely at what's been going on in Europe since the Second World War, particularly the CIA, once it was created, their support for Ukrainian Nazis as part of the US Cold War effort, the idea of false flags, very much in the NATO intelligence pocket right the way through the 1980s in order to stop the Italians bringing in a communist government. Operation Gladio in Italy saw the far right in Italy actually blowing up individuals in squares and various places around Italy and blaming it on the communists. So the idea was that the far right could actually kill Italian people within Italy and then try and blame it on the Russians. Well, many people in Italy did believe it. Many people didn't. They even actually assassinated Aldo Moro as well, Prime Minister. So there's been a big load of activity from the NATO intelligence services right throughout Europe. The same sort of thing going on in Belgium, by the way, when the Belgian government tried to reject US cruise missiles. And the actual pedigree of these far-right Operation Gladio forces, as many people don't know this, but at the end of the Second World War, the SS the Nazis created stay-behind forces that they called werewolves. Their job was to create sabotage behind enemy lines as the Allies advanced towards Berlin. And the same tactics have been used to stay behind forces, weapons caches, this sort of thing. They couldn't resist using them, and so they used them for political purposes. I think what we're looking at now is almost like the most recent phase, the most recent stage of this, quite possibly, using the same sort of tricks. And the big culprits for me are the Western press. We had, for example, no interrogation today as the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, called for the Russians to be, the Orthodox Church in Russia, to be expelled from the World Council of Churches. What they didn't tell us, that actually Rowan Williams, even though he was Archbishop of Canterbury, was initiated into the Order of Druids, which is completely the opposite of the Christian Church. And so what you had, the farce of a Druid telling the world that the Russian Orthodox Church should be ejected from the World Council of Churches, with no interrogation, no background whatsoever in the Western press. So I think there's a very powerful, a very big campaign right across the Western press to demonize Russia. Paul Burrell, the former French intelligence officer, he actually called it, he said the secret code name in NATO is Operation Beluga, the idea being to discredit Russia, to discredit Putin. And of course, the idea is here that they can then get away with all sorts of stricter measures and even a potential move to a third world war against Russia if Russia can be discredited in this way. I think that's what we've been seeing over the last few days with these provocations, but I may be proved wrong. I don't like to try and come to conclusions before we've had evidence from both sides and a proper investigation.
Indeed, something that doesn't seem to actually come into fruition at this point. So Ian Williams, our guest there from Bristol, Tony Gosling, talks about the fact that both the U.S. and NATO in turn are maybe after something bigger in terms of the way that they are going after Russia. I mean, Russia at this point is the most sanctioned country in the world. I'm not too sure how much more damage they can do to Russia. Of course, economically, there's still some more damage they can do. What I'd like to ask you, Ian Williams, is in the area of negotiations. There was a particular interesting article coming out from the Washington Post that said that NATO says Ukraine to decide on peace deal with Russia, but with limits. Now that raises question marks here. Why would there be limits on how Ukraine negotiates with Russia?
Look, I don't think the Washington Post is speaking for the government in Washington, let alone the government in Kiev. And what we've just heard is a long list of completely circumstantial, occasionally accurate diatribes about NATO. No fan of NATO, no fan of the United States, completely think that My Lai massacre should be prosecuted and dug up again. Yes, Deir Yassin and Sabra and Shatila should be prosecuted. Yes, Gaza should be prosecuted. This should be prosecuted. We have Russian troops on a sovereign United Nations members' territory. They went in unprovoked. There are no Ukrainian troops on Russian territory. They massacred. We have evidence, unashamed evidence from the Russians that they have used weapons of mass destruction against civilians in the cities. They've blown apart Kiev. They've blown apart the rest. So anything about Second World War preparations, werewolves, Gladio, it's about as relevant as introducing the Roman gladiators into the proceedings. Yes, people were killed then. People are being killed now by Moscow. They're being killed in defiance of international law.
Well,
it is a crime of aggression for the Russians to go into Ukraine. It is a war crime and a violation of the Geneva Conventions to shoot prisoners, to shoot civilians. They have such a charge sheet against them, and no amount of bleating and counter accusations. They have not shown any evidence that the Ukrainians.
But when there are possibilities of talks, when there are possibilities of talks, you don't think that this is true? That perhaps that NATO and I should say the U.S. Leading the way have motives that this resolution cannot come about unless we really deal a heavy blow to Russia?
No, they've said quite strongly that it's up to the Ukrainians. It's the Ukrainians who are saying we cannot agree to terms while these evil cutthroats have a knife at our throats, are raping our women and blowing up our children.
But they've said
that's a very reasonable position.
They have said issues of global security are at stake here, and you can't just give concessions. They've blatantly said that. So Zelensky's...
Whose concessions? Whose concessions? Somebody comes into your house, he grabs hold of your daughter, holds a knife to her throat, and then asks you why you're not conceding and being reasonable. Where is the justice in this? I think there's something missing in the state of balance. Whataboutery has gone mad here. It really has. You do not invade somebody else's country and then blame them for imposing conditions on talking to you. You get